Now within the Eclipse IDE, we're going to demonstrate an example of using a try-catch-throw block. We're going to input from the user an integer. That will be the normal course of events. And if he does what he's supposed to do, then nothing exceptional will happen. However, if he doesn't do what he's supposed to do and he enters something other than an integer, that would constitute an exception. And we're going to deal with that as an exception in this code. So again, the try block can focus on doing what would normally be done, and if something exceptional happens, instead of attempting to deal with it in the try block, we have this separate mechanism called a catch block that can now deal with it. Let's create a new Java project to do this in, and it's going to be called Input Mismatch Exception Demo. So Input Mismatch Exception Demo. I'm going to need to use that string again, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the clipboard with a Control-C so I don't have to retype that, because the class that I'm going to produce is going to have the same name here. So within my project, I'm creating a new class, and as I said, it will also be called the same thing. So I'm just going to do a Control-V here and plug that straight in here, make sure it's spelled right, looks good. And we are going to have a main method, so let's go ahead and throw that in too by putting a check mark there. And now we're all set and ready to go. Before we get started, we are going to have to import a bunch of stuff from java.util, so why don't we just say import java.util.star. Oh, and I guess we need a semicolon at the end of that line. Alright, so far so good. Things are looking just fine, and now we continue on our way. We're going to be inputting values from the keyboard. We'll need a scanner to do that, so let's go ahead and create one right now. So scanner input equals new scanner system.in, and now that's ready to go. And we're also going to create or declare a Boolean variable here called continue input. And its purpose will be to act as a flag to indicate whether we should continue waiting for proper input or whether we finally have proper input, hence continue input. And we initialize it to true, indicating that initially we should continue looping until proper input comes, in which case we will set this flag to false. So until the user enters what they're supposed to, that is an integer, this flag is going to stay true, and we're going to keep looping and looping forever until we finally get an integer put in. The reason this is demonstrating something called an input mismatch exception error is because we're expecting an integer, and if some other type, string or double, comes in, that would constitute an input mismatch, and we'll deal with that as an exception and show how to do that using this try catch block method. So we're going to do something in a do while loop until we don't need to continue input. So as long as continue input is true, then we'll continue iterating on this do while loop. Finally, when the user does do what they're supposed to do and enters an integer, then we won't continue looping, waiting for that to happen. So that's the purpose of our do while loop. Within the loop, as soon as we detect that an integer, a proper input, has been provided, then we'll set this continue input flag to false, and that will stop our looping. The first thing we're going to do within this loop is we're going to set up a try-catch block, because the try block will deal with the normal expected things, that is, the user does what they're supposed to do and they go ahead and they enter an integer, and the catch block will occur when an exception occurs, when they don't enter a proper integer. So let's go ahead and put the catch block in as well here now. So we've got ourselves a try and a catch block. You recall from earlier discussions now that the try block is always going to have the potential to generate an exception. Let's fill in the try block. So the first thing that's going to happen within our try block is we're going to go ahead and print a prompt for the user asking them to enter an integer. They may or may not do that. Hopefully they will. That would be the normal course of events. But sometimes they may not, and that would be an exception that we need to deal with. So we say enter an integer colon blank, and then we'll see if they actually did or not. So we're going to declare an integer called number here, and we're going to set it equal to whatever comes in from our scanner, specifically the next integer that comes in. So we do a next int. So input dot next int. Because we said next int, the input better be an integer, and if it's not, then that would constitute an exception. In fact, it would constitute an input mismatch exception. If that happens, then an exception will be thrown, and we will bail out of this code and go no further. But that's the exceptional circumstance. Let's assume it's a normal circumstance, and in fact the user obediently entered an integer like they were supposed to. Then we're just going to continue on, and in continuing on, we're going to do a system.out.println, and we're going to go ahead and print the number that was entered with an appropriate message. So the message will be the number entered is blank, and then to that we will concatenate the value that got entered, which is just simply number. That then was the end of our statement for the print line. And of course, it's very important now to set the continue input flag that we talked about earlier equal to false, because otherwise we'll still continue to loop indefinitely here. But now that we set that to false, the while loop at the bottom, that is way down here, is now going to see while false, and it will stop iterating, it'll stop looping, and we've actually done the program at that point. There's no more to do. That's the normal course of event. The unusual or exceptional course, where an exception gets thrown, is that when we try to do this line right here, notice I said try, it's a try block, right? When we try to do this, it fails, and an exception occurs because the user does not enter an integer. And when that occurs, we abort the rest of this. So we don't do the rest of these statements that you see here, but instead we jump straight to the catch block and deal with the exception, or process the exception. How are we going to process this exception? Well, we simply tell the user what happened by using system.out.println, and we print a message that says try again, period, and in brackets some instruction about what exactly went wrong here. So we say incorrect input and then a colon, and be very specific to the user and tell them an integer is required. Okay, so we've left nothing to the user's imagination. We've been very specific. We told them exactly what went wrong and why an exception occurred, and now we're going to give them the opportunity to correct their evil ways and input what they were supposed to input. So before we go on, we're going to discard the entire rest of the line. We can't trust what's there. The user was supposed to enter an integer. They put something else there. We don't know what else is on the line. So let's just go ahead and grab the entire rest of the line by doing an input dot next line. And we haven't assigned that to any variable. We just simply do it and throw it away. So whatever else remains on that line is now gone, in preparation for giving the user a clean slate to start over in his attempt to enter an integer. Now there is one small syntax error that you can see here, and of course it's because you just can't say catch. You have to say what exception you're expecting to catch, because many different kinds of exceptions could get thrown, and we're going to learn that we can have a number of catch blocks potentially, one to deal with each possible type of exception that may get thrown. Now in our case, the particular exception object is of class input mismatch exception. So we need to indicate that that is the particular kind of exception that we're expecting to catch. And we do that by saying here catch input mismatch exception. We have to give it a name, even though we're not going to be using it. We'll call it EX because that would be traditional. It would be usual to just call it EX for exception. And now we have some code that should run just fine. So let's go ahead and try this out and see what happens. So we're going to click on this and click on this, and now it's running, prompting us to enter an integer. Let's suppose that instead of an integer we enter 3.4, which is not an integer. An exception is going to be thrown. That means we're not going to continue on. So think about where we are in the code right now. We're inputting a number, so we're sitting right here. If an exception occurs, we're going to bail out, which means we should not see this prompt. It should not say the number entered is, and we are not going to set the input continue input flag to false. Rather, we're going to bail out of here completely and find ourselves down in the catch block catching an input mismatch exception error, and we are going to then print this message that you see here, try again, blah 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 blah, and we will clear the rest of the line, and then we'll drop out of the catch block. But because we're in a bigger while loop, and because continue input is now still true, then we'll go up and repeat the do loop again, and therefore we'll give it a new try, and maybe things will work out better this time. Or if it doesn't and another exception happens, we'll find ourselves yet again down in the catch block processing it. Well, let's go ahead and make another exception happen. So first of all, you notice we did jump to the catch block as promised, and it says try again, incorrect input in integer is required. And now we're back in the try block with a fresh prompt, enter an integer, and let's do something bad again. Let's enter some string here. Again, same thing happened. It's not an integer, it's not acceptable. The same input exception mismatch occurs, and we find ourselves going through the same catch mechanism and ultimately back in a new try. This time, let's finally enter an integer. 345, that's a good integer. Let's hit enter and see what happens this time. So the program is now done, and instead it went ahead and continued with the rest of the try block for the very first time. This is the first time we saw that happen in this run, and it printed the number entered is, and it went ahead and showed the value of the number 345. It went ahead and did this line and set continue input flag to false, and then when it of course it's going to skip the catch block because you only do that when an exception occurs. So if you make it to the end of the try block and no exception has occurred, then of course you don't go on to do the catch block, you skip it and you find yourself down here. But now that the continue input flag has been set to false, this condition right here will be false, and we will not continue iterating on the do while loop. Instead, we will fall through and there's no more code, so we're done at that point. That then is the end of this demo.